So welcome everybody. Thank you for coming to this session. I know you have a lot of options, so it's much appreciated. So today what we're going to be talking about is insider threats, ransomware attacks, and cyber attacks. This is a topic that's gaining momentum. We've all heard about the recent ransomware attacks and data breaches, WannaCry, NotPetya, Equifax, the list goes on and on. So what we're going to do today is explore some of the modern insider threats, ransomware attacks. What are the mechanisms? How do these attacks take place? Why is it so easy for hackers or for malicious actors to steal data or to harm an organization? And then what are some preventative measures we can take moving forward to really protect our most critical assets from these insider threats and from these data breaches? So my name is Justin Wilkins. I'm the manager of systems engineering for Varonis, based out of Washington, D.C., and I work with organizations from Ohio all the way down to the Carolinas. And so that's a large swath of geographical area, and I work with customers across financial verticals, healthcare, manufacturing. Any organization that cares about their data is an organization that I'm involved with. So again, a brief background about insider threats, where we are today, why is it such a big problem, insider threat mechanisms and real-world examples. So how do these insider threats and data breaches occur, and what are some real-world examples, and how do those data breaches occur? We'll talk about ransomware as a canary in the coal mine, so as a notification mechanism that might be indicative of a more severe problem down the line. And then lastly, we'll talk about some strategies to really mitigate those insider threats and move towards a secure model for ultimately what are your most critical assets, which are your unstructured human-generated data. So a little bit of background about my organization and where we came from, so you have some context into how we're going about this problem. So we were founded back in 2005 by two storage engineers from NetApp named Yaki and Ohad. And Yaki and Ohad were working on a very large project off of the coast of Angola in West Africa to take high-resolution images of the ocean floor. Now, one day, all this data went missing, and the organization had no clue where that data went, who was accessing that data, or even who had access to it to begin with. So this was millions of dollars worth of very critical data completely gone. And the organization had no visibility into what happened or who could have been at fault. So from there, Varonis was born, and we've really evolved from identifying audit events, permission visibility, into a full data security platform to really protect an organization's unstructured data from insider threats or other insidious behaviors. So this slide here has all the data breaches from 2005 up to about 2015. And one of the things you'll notice is that not only are these bubbles growing bigger, but they're growing more dense. Right? This is a growing problem. Right? Things like Bitcoin, anonymous payment options. It's a very lucrative business model, and this data is very at risk. Right? And we're seeing more and more data breaches, and there's now executive level accountability for some of these events. This is no longer a security engineering problem or a sysadmin problem or even an IT problem. This is a board level, this is an organizational problem, and it has a direct impact to the bottom line of the business. Look at the recent Equifax breach. They had a pretty significant drop in their stock prices once that breach was announced. So what do these breaches have in common? Number one, that threat was already inside. So think about Edward Snowden, Panama Papers, Target. This was a user or an individual that already had access to this data, whether it's an employee behaving maliciously or if it's somebody whose credentials have been compromised, and they're using those credentials to get access and exfiltrate that data. This isn't somebody hacking into the firewall, bypassing perimeter security. This is a user that's simply using their credentials to access sensitive data. Number two, unstructured data was leaked or stolen. So these are emails, data sitting on file servers, large NAS, SAN. This is your human-generated data, so think about your Excel documents, Word documents, information that holds intellectual property or sensitive information about employees, social security numbers, credit card data. This is the type of data these hackers are after. And number three, traditional security approaches did not work. Every single one of these large organizations, Equifax, Sony, Target, DLA Piper, they all had very sophisticated perimeter protection schemes in place, but they were still unable to prevent these insider threats or these ransomware attacks. Now, why is this problem growing? Number one, it's very easy for a hacker to get inside an organization. So this graphic here was a 5-year-old boy who really wanted to play Call of Duty, Unfortunately, his parents put those pesky parental controls in place. So in order to bypass those parental controls, he simply entered the space bar until the buffer was overloaded. And then he was granted access to Call of Duty, and he was able to play it whenever he wanted. Now, Microsoft actually awarded him a bounty for this bug, and he now plays Call of Duty whenever he wants for the rest of his life. But it gives you an idea, a 5-year-old boy can bypass security controls for a very large organization like Microsoft that probably has countless software engineers. They recruit some of the best in the industry. If somebody wants to get inside your network, they're probably going to be able to. Number 2, employees make mistakes. So think about a user conducting their day-to-day tasks. They're interacting with files, folders, or moving data. A simple drag and drop, right? A user accidentally grabs a directory containing a large number of sensitive documents into a public-facing entity, and that data is now overexposed. A user accidentally delivers an email to johndoe@gmail.com instead of johndoe@company.com, right? These events happen all the time, and if we have thousands of users interacting with hundreds of files and documents and emails every single day, it's inevitable that somebody's going to make a mistake that's going to expose data to unnecessary individuals. Number 2, phishing attacks are very successful. So this was a Verizon study that looked at the success rate of phishing attacks, and what they found was 23% of all recipients will actually open up those emails, and 11% of those recipients will actually click on the attachments. This is a very high success rate. If I send an email to 10 people, at least one of those individuals is going to click on that link, open up that email, and click on that link. Right? That means I can get access to those credentials, or in the event of ransomware, that means I can deploy ransomware onto the file system and begin encrypting data and then collect a payout. So phishing attacks are remarkably successful. And the reason why is because users click on links almost indiscriminately. Right? User gets an email. I was working with a very large utility company in the Washington, D.C. area, and they were hit by ransomware through their accounting department, and this ransomware vector was a fake Excel invoice. Well, their accounting team would click on this invoice. They didn't understand exactly what happened, so instead of notifying IT, they forwarded that email around to their colleagues, and their colleagues then forwarded that email to their bosses. So now you had this ransomware being deployed by multiple individuals and through multiple levels of privilege escalation, right, all the way at the director level. So it gives you an idea of how severe this problem is. It doesn't matter how well you train the end users. These phishing attacks are getting very sophisticated, and at some point somebody's going to click on these links. Even without employee intervention, it's very easy to steal credentials. So this is a device called the Wi-Fi Pineapple, and I'm sure most of you are aware, anytime that you have your preferred network, either at home or at work, you'll have your setting to auto-connect. Well, some people will do this to public networks, like in an airport or at a Starbucks. And what happens is this device is going to intercept that connection, and it's going to say, yes, I am actually your preferred Wi-Fi network, and then begin harvesting credentials. So this is readily available on Amazon.com, and it's very easy to steal credentials through this method. Most users, you probably have friends or colleagues that have their auto-connect set up for Starbucks or their favorite airport. And then, not only that, but end users are going to make errors with sensitive data. Data security is not their utmost priority. You can see here this user, this Twitter user, was so excited about her new credit card that she decided to post it on Twitter for billions of users, and a full credit card, expiration date, and probably the CCV code as well, right? Not realizing that this could actually end up being used to steal that credit card information. Right? And then once a user is inside of the network, this simple regex here, this will actually go out and find every single document that contains a credit card number. So once the user's credentials are hijacked, either through phishing attacks, man-in-the-middle attacks, they're going to be able to very quickly identify all that sensitive data within the environment, right, through a simple PowerShell command. And this is something that's rarely available on almost all Windows workstations. Now, speaking of insider threats, you may have heard of this story. So this is Hollywood Presbyterian Medical Center in Los Angeles, California, and they were hit by Lockheed back in February 2016. And as a part of this ransomware attack, the hackers requested a 40 Bitcoin payout, which is the equivalent of 17,000 US dollars back then. So you might think that this is a very large amount in order to recover data or turn off a piece of software. But what is a hospital's data actually worth? So what are their services worth? We can look at the schedule of costs for Hollywood Presbyterian Medical Center, and we'll find that a CT scan is worth about $42,000. So they're making about $110,000 per day for that CT scanner. Now, if we extrapolate this out, Hollywood Presbyterian Medical Center was under attack for about 10 days, and they had to resort to pen and paper, manual record entry, communication. That's $1 million just in lost revenue from the CT scanner alone. This isn't taking into account recovery efforts, loss of efficiencies for the business, or other services the hospital simply couldn't provide because they were inundated by ransomware. And this is a life or death situation. This hospital had to turn away patients because they were unable to service them. Pretty severe. And there could also be more severe implications of a ransomware attack. You may have heard of this story, but there was a hacker based out of Kosovo that was infiltrating large U.S. retailers and requesting a $500 payout in Bitcoin. Well, most retailers would simply pay the ransom or recover their data, and they wouldn't necessarily report it. They would think it was a small-time criminal trying to extract money, which is usually the case. But one retailer actually reported this incident to the FBI, and what they found is that this hacker was actually using this Bitcoin payout in order to collect a hit list for ISIS. Okay, so there are also national security implications of some of these ransomware attacks, depending on what type of vertical you're in. And this is a growing problem. Right? We'll see the spike happen right around the time that Hollywood Presbyterian was hit, around February 2016, and it's really shown no signs of slowing down. There are around 4,000 new infections per hour and around 100,000 new ransomware infections per day. Again, this is a very lucrative business model. It's very easy to get inside of a network, deploy ransomware, and collect the payout anonymously. And for a small-time hacker, it's very easy to collect a payout anonymously, and it's very unlikely the FBI is going to have the resources to go out and investigate. This is much easier to do if you're a criminal organization than kidnapping, right? And regardless of the vertical, regardless of the size of the organization, everyone is susceptible to ransomware. We looked at a U.S. school system, church, police department. It doesn't matter how large or how small the organization is, everybody needs to take preventive measures for ransomware attacks. Now, why is ransomware so dangerous once it becomes an insider? Number one, users have a ton of access. So according to the Opm Institute, almost 2/3 of individuals claim that they have access to data they should never see. This would be somebody in facilities having access to HR or having access to payroll information or accounts receivable. We see this all the time with organizations that we work with. And almost 1/3 of all individuals claim, or almost 2/3 of all individuals claim that IT does not enforce a least privilege model. So what this means is we're so focused on protecting the data from the perimeter, right, the sophisticated firewall, perimeter security, network protection, that we neglect to really protect the data inside of the network. So revoking access when it's no longer needed, and then ensuring that the users that have access to that data are the users that need access in order to do their job. Number two, very few people watch what individuals are doing once they're inside of the network. Right, so you might be watching the network, you might be collecting firewall logs, but what a lot of organizations aren't doing is actually monitoring user access inside of the network. And only about 1/3 of all organizations actually monitor file and email activity. The reason why is it's very cumbersome, it's very resource intensive, it's very difficult to do on a regular basis, but it's ultimately very critical for data security. So what has changed? One, you no longer need to have technical expertise to deploy a ransomware variant. So Ransom 32 was very unique in that it was the first ever ransomware as a service. So you've heard of software as a service, infrastructure as a service. Well, ransomware as a service is also a very lucrative business model. So with Ransom32, you can download the client from Tor. You specify who you want to attack, the payout that you want to request. It will go out. It will send the ransomware payloads, deploy the ransomware, get the encryption keys, collect a payout. It will do everything. All you need to do is provide emails, and they simply take a 25% cut of all the profits. So you no longer need to have technical aptitude to deploy ransomware. You just need the will to do harm. Not only that, but Bitcoin. The first ever ransomware variant was released back in 1989 at a health symposium in Panama City, Panama. And what happened is, once this ransomware was deployed, the hackers would turn off and turn back on your workstation. It would get it into an infinite loop. Now, in order to recover your data, you're required to send a check or money order to a post office box in Panama. Right? So there's a paper trail there. Right? There's a paper trail there. It was time-consuming to collect this payout. Well, now with Bitcoin, it's very easy. You can do it online, completely anonymously, and it's very difficult to track. Now, as we mentioned earlier, ransomware is really considered to be the canary in the coal mine. So this is the type of insider threat that really lets you know that something's wrong within the environment. Right? Ransomware is unique in that it's the only insider threat that actually wants itself to be known. It wants to scream. It wants you to know that it's there so that way you can collect a payout. What a lot of organizations don't know is that a successful ransomware attack is indicative of far more severe issues within the environment that need to be addressed. Right? Ransomware attack is indicative that you could be susceptible to a much more severe threat like the Equifax data breach, the Target data breach, etc. So now let's talk about some of the other insider threats. The first up is Disgruntled Dan. So Disgruntled Dan is your typical disgruntled employee. This is an individual that's unhappy with his job. Maybe he's going to get fired. He might be able to get he might be able to benefit financially from taking or stealing data. This is your Edward Snowden. This is your Panama Papers scenario. Right? And this is also your Gregory Chung scenario. So for those of you that haven't heard of Gregory Chung, this was Edward Snowden before there was Edward Snowden. So Gregory Chung was able to exfiltrate $2 billion worth of documents from Boeing over the course of 30 years and is able to do so completely undetected. Now, when the FBI finally apprehended Gregory Chung, they found $250,000 worth of very sensitive technical documents buried underneath his house. So he was able to exfiltrate billions of dollars worth of documents over 30 years completely undetected. Now, if he would have stopped at year 39, he may have never been caught. Right? And the reality is a lot of organizations simply have no clue or have no visibility into whether or not data has been stolen. And then we've all heard about Edward Snowden. What's unique about Edward Snowden is that he was using credentials that he already had, and he was simply escalating his privileges within the environment, gaining access to more and more data, continued to exfiltrate that data, and then once he had all the documents that he was looking for, he then fled the country, and by then it was too late. Right? And to this day, Booz has no clue to the extent of the damage or all of the files that were potentially impacted. Right? At this point, you have to assume that every single file on the network could have been compromised. The next actor is abusive admin Andy. So this is a disgruntled administrator. Now, administrators are unique in that they have access to a lot of data. They have access to directory services. They have access to local administrator accounts on critical data repositories. So they can really do a lot of damage if they were to become disgruntled. So here's an example of a system administrator that really wanted a beach house out in Florida, and it didn't look like he was contributing to his 401k like he wanted to during the course of his career. So because of that, he needed to finance his beach house, and to do that, he decided to steal a bunch of data. Now, he was eventually caught, but because he had access to all this data already, it wouldn't necessarily throw any red flags if he was using his account, like normal, to go out and access this data. He was eventually caught, but that data theft is very common. The second example here is a Citibank IT admin that had a bad performance review, so he thought he was going to be fired. So because of this, he decided to bring down 90% of Citibank's North American IT network. This is just one user was able to bring down 90% of all of Citi's North American IT infrastructure. Very powerful. You can imagine what the damage was like for Citi. My assumption is this probably cost them in the 6 or even 7 figures. You're talking about a lot of downtime, a long recovery effort. And this was simply an admin that was upset, and he wanted to show management what he could do. He had access to all this information within directory services, file servers. He was able to very easily bring down the network because he had access to all this data. So a lot of times organizations do a good job of monitoring when those credentials are checked out. So who's using them and at what times. But they don't necessarily do a good job of monitoring how those credentials are being used once they're checked out. And if we looked at insider threats, administrator accounts, service accounts, test accounts, executive accounts, those are very susceptible to compromised credentials because they have access to so much data, and because hijacking those credentials is very lucrative for hackers. The next one is hijacked Hillary. So hijacked Hillary is somebody that's normal employee. They're not necessarily behaving maliciously. They've clicked on a link in an Excel document. Somebody calls them and says, hey, can I get your username and password? I'm John from IT. Or, hey, Microsoft says that your computer is going to shut down. Please give me your credentials immediately so I can make sure that that doesn't happen. So this is somebody whose credentials were hijacked, and that hacker is using that individual's credentials in order to access more and more data. So a big example here is the Sony data breach, where hackers were able to compromise credentials and remain inside of the network for over a year completely undetected. So they had a year to go out and find whatever data they needed and then exfiltrate that content, and then you all know how the story ends. The CEO was actually fired as a result, or she was forced to step down, Amy Pascal, as a result of this data breach. The next one here might be pretty common to a lot of you. Target. So Target was unique in that it was a result of over-permissiveness and the inability of Target to really monitor how that data was being used in the environment. So for the Target data breach, there was a refrigeration contractor that had access to all of Target's POS data. So a refrigeration company that had no rights to access that content, they didn't need access to the POS data. Right? Why does a refrigeration company need access to credit card information? Well, as a part of their password policy, they would stick Post-it notes in the water cooler on the username and password to access those critical systems. So the credentials were compromised, and then that refrigeration company was able to, or the hacker was able to use the credentials for this refrigeration company to access all of Target's POS data. And you all know how that ended. Right? Target ended up costing Target $162 million, and they're continuing to settle. Right? They just settled with the states for another $18.5 million a couple months ago. And this was all because Target did not restrict access to sensitive information to the individuals that needed access. And this is interesting. This might be a good exercise for those of you after this talk to go out and look and see if your organization is on this website. But this is a website that will rent access to servers for most Fortune 500 companies. And as an example, you can rent access to one of Cisco's file servers within their network for $5.48 an hour. So not only is it very easy to compromise credentials to get access to the network, but it's very likely already been done. Right? Especially if you're a large organization, you've probably been a target in the past, and your credentials are probably available for sale, either in the darknet or through this website. And you can buy access. And then once you're inside of the network, right, at that point it's very easy to find what you need, get access to sensitive data, move laterally from server to server, elevate privileges, and cause a lot of harm to the organization. So what data is most vulnerable to insider threats, to ransomware attacks? This is that unstructured data. And the reason why is because, number one, right, it's easy to encrypt. It has access to, it contains a lot of an organization's most critical assets, and it's growing exponentially. Within the next 5 years, 80% of the data growth will be in the unstructured data realm. So this isn't data stored in Oracle, SQL, ERP platforms. This is data stored on file servers, SharePoint, Exchange. And this unstructured data, not only does it contain sensitive information like credit cards, socials, intellectual property, but it also contains typically critical information about how to access structured data platforms. So if we look at the Opm breach, which was a massive breach, probably the largest or most damaging before the Equifax breach a couple weeks ago, the hackers were able to use simple SMB commands to go out on the file server, so on the unstructured data repositories, and identify usernames and passwords for OPM's PIP system that had information about all the employees, social security numbers, all the personal identifiable information about those employees was easily accessible once they had that username and password. And that was a simple SMB command, searches to find plain text passwords on the file shares. And as I mentioned earlier, this is no longer a sysadmin problem. This is really a business problem. There's board-level accountability all the way up the chain. Amy Pascal, as a result of the Sony breach, was forced to step down. The Target CEO was the first CEO that was fired as a result of the data breach. And these are becoming very, very expensive. Not only due to the recovery efforts involved, right, we look at hospitals that are hit by ransomware attacks and they're down for a week, 10 days. They're having to turn away patients and not provide basic services. You look at Equifax, where millions, hundreds of millions of sensitive files were breached, and they're probably going to be settling for numbers probably in the hundreds of millions, if not billions, as a result of this breach. So now that we've gone over the landscape, identified the mechanisms associated with those breaches and ransomware attacks, what are some of the things that we can do moving forward in order to protect ourselves? Ideally, as organizations, we want to get to the time frame where we're identifying data breaches or insider threats within hours and minutes as opposed to months and years. So of the individuals that actually know that they've been breached, around 70% don't find out until several months or several years after the fact. Now, this is for the organization to actually know that they've been breached. A lot of times, hackers will be inside of your network, getting access to data, stealing information, and you'll have no visibility. So the goal is to get down to this hours, seconds, minutes, and days. Right? That's where we want to be. So there's 3 ways that we can get there. Number 1 is detect. So in order to really protect these assets, we need to know where these assets live. This involves inventorying who has access to what data, so full permission visibility across every single platform. And what does John Doe in accounting have access to? What directories, data repositories, SharePoint sites, Exchange mailboxes are open to global groups? Or where do those global groups have access in the environment? Where do I have sensitive data? Where are my critical assets like PCI, PII, GLBA, HIPAA? Where is this data, and then who has access to it, and is it exposed to the right individuals? A lot of companies do a good job about DLP and identifying data, sensitive data in motion, but since the data at rest is a very difficult task. Step 2, once you've identified this information, begin monitoring how users are interacting with that data on a regular basis. So auditing user behavior, and then marrying those audit events with sensitive data and permission visibility so you can understand whether that data is being used appropriately. Right? If somebody outside of HR is accessing data that contains a large number of employee IDs or social security information, we want to know why that is. I want to be able to investigate. Remediating access across those unstructured data repositories, so removing access to mobile groups first. So exposure to high-risk assets, like assets that contain sensitive data. Moving towards a least privilege model where you're revoking access for users that no longer need access to their data in order to do their job. Look at the Target scenario. If Target would have revoked access to their POS data for the refrigeration company, that data breach would never have happened. And then begin to monitor how those users are interacting with data, and then alerting and setting up honeypots so you can detect in real time anytime those users are behaving maliciously. And then the third phase is the sustainability. So we want to monitor how that data is being used on a regular basis. We want to conduct our remediation so that we enforce a least privilege model, which is a proven methodology to really protect those assets. And then over time, we want to automate the access request workflow. So if you're using an identity access management solution like ServiceNow, SailPoint, we want to be able to automate that request workflow where instead of IT granting and invoking access indiscriminately, those requests are being routed directly to the business owners. The business owners themselves are deciding who should and who shouldn't have access because they have the most insight as to the context of that data. And then moving forward, as an organization, enforcing regular entitlement reviews so that way users or business owners are forced to attest on a regular basis to who should and who shouldn't have access to that data. So you're sustaining that remediation effort that you've done up front, and then you're maintaining that least privilege model moving forward. You're ensuring that you don't have permissions creep or excessive permissions that are responsible for so many of these data breaches. So summary, obviously ransomware is an epidemic. It's growing exponentially. It's not going away anytime soon. It's a very lucrative business model, much better than kidnapping, extortion, right? Very easy, very simple, and very easy to deploy. And ransomware really illustrates how soft we are at protecting our data from the inside out. So we do a good job, again, with perimeter security, but once that ransomware variant or once that user is actually inside of our network, all visibility and all controls are lost. Other insider threats can be much more dangerous. A lot of you probably have backup or disaster recovery plans that you've practiced. There's an old saying that everybody has backups, but not everybody has restores. Hopefully everybody here has restores. But when we talk about a massive data breach like Equifax, that's far more damaging. Right? That's a very expensive data breach. And files and emails are our most frequent targets. Why? For files, they contain critical information. That's everybody's working documents, right? Everybody has Excel documents, PowerPoints, Word docs. And email is where an organization's most sensitive communications are taking place. We've seen administrators using service accounts to go in and read C-level mailboxes to get M&A information and use that information for insider trading. Right? So all of that information, right, that's where that's communicated. So the approach here is to not just focus on the perimeter, which is obviously needed, right? When we peel back the onion, we need the security at the perimeter, but we also need to focus also on the inside. So detecting where all of our sensitive data sits, in identifying who has access to what content, marrying that with the sensitive data to identify areas of overexposure, areas of risk, so we can monitor those assets more closely in the future, and then really sustaining that process moving forward. So once you've done all the upfront work, you've done the remediation, you've revoked excessive permissions, you want to sustain that process. That way you're not having to do this all over again, and that way you're enforcing a good governance model for your most critical data. And then as an organization, we do offer a risk assessment, so shameless plug here. And if you guys are interested in taking advantage of that, talk to me afterwards. But we can give you an assessment as to where you stand in your unstructured data, so where sensitive data sits, permission visibility, permission overexposures, things like dormant service accounts that might not be used anymore. And then we can pile this up into a 30-page executive level report. So. That's it. That's all I have. Yeah, so if you have source code, you send TIFFs or GIFs? Yeah. Yep.
Oh, well, in JITs. In other words, the data is sitting in fast, but they're moving it from TSF into a JITs repository.
A JIT repository, yeah, a GitHub. Like a Git repository. Yeah, no, we wouldn't hide into that.
Okay. That was
yeah, that's a good use of it. Source code is something you really want to protect.
Right. I don't know any other tools.
Yeah. Wait, what's that?
Is there any other tools that you could leverage?
Get into Git and monitor how the data is being used. I don't know if the Git has an API. You have to see if they have an audit API, and then there might be some search behind the Git. Did it hurt? I don't know if they have something like that. But that's a good point, right? That's an example. We were working with a customer, and we found out that their